In this lesson, I want to show you how inline styles work in React. Now, inline styles are generally considered bad practice because they're not reusable. Every element is styled individually and manually and independently, and that doesn't really allow for easy duplication of styles. However, HTML still does support inline styles, and so does JSX, and there are a couple differences between the syntax in regular HTML versus JSX. So I do want to take a quick lesson to show you those differences. All right, so as a reminder, the way that inline styles work is we can provide a style attribute and then provide, in traditional HTML, a string with the styles in the form of CSS attributes and values that we want to apply to that specific element. So as an example, if I scroll down in my app file, here is my header component and it renders a header element. The way this works in regular HTML is we provide a style attribute and we assign style to a string. And in the string, we can use any regular CSS property, and then we use the traditional CSS property value syntax that we typically use in our CSS files. So just as a quick reminder, in app.css, we use this kind of syntax, right? We have the name, then the colon, and the value we want to assign. So for example, in regular inline styles, if I wanted to assign the background color property and give it a value of red, that syntax would look like this: background dash color, and then a colon, and then red, and then the semicolon to conclude that CSS declaration. As it turns out, and as you can observe from the crashing app on the right, this syntax will not work in JSX. This is once again due to the underlying nature of what JSX is. Under the hood, this is all JavaScript, right? So for example, in JavaScript, we don't actually support dashes. So that's an example of where the transpilation might fail and not work properly. So it's for that reason that this is an example where we have to do a slightly different approach. The exact same way that in regular HTML we use class and in JSX we use class name, this is another one of those examples. So in JSX, instead of passing a string here, what we want to pass is a JavaScript object. And remember, a JavaScript object is a JavaScript construct, so we can't just do it inline like so, because this is not going to work. So as we know in JSX, whenever we have something that should be evaluated as a JavaScript expression, we need a pair of curly braces. So this begins the interpretation of whatever's inside those curly braces as JavaScript. Then we need to declare an actual JavaScript object. So here we're going to place another pair of curly braces. All right, so once again, let me just bring my cursor down. The first pair of curly braces right here is for the JSX declaration syntax, and the second pair of curly braces that are yellow on my screen, those are the ones for the actual JavaScript object declaration. In here, what we do is we write the actual CSS properties that we want. There is one big exception, and that is we cannot use hyphens. So wherever we have a CSS property that has a hyphen, we have to replace it with an upper camel case equivalent. So for example, instead of background dash color, which doesn't work in JavaScript, that's not valid syntax, instead of that, we do background color. So remove all of the hyphens or the dashes and turn everything into upper camel case. So make sure the first letter of every subsequent word is capitalized, right? That's just one example. Here's another, for example, if we have something like justify content in regular HTML, that's going to be justify content like so if we are doing inline style objects in JSX. As another example, if we have something like align items in regular HTML, in JSX, this would be align items. So whenever we're using the inline style attribute and we're providing that object in JSX, all the CSS properties must be written like so. No dashes, no hyphens, and then capitalize the first letter of every subsequent word. So now that we understand that, we can go back to the original example, and I can assign background color to a string of, let's say, red, and save that. And you can see the app is back up and running. It does look completely ugly, by the way, but that's not a problem. We can see that the code itself does work. Now, as a quick reminder, styles like this, inline styles, have higher CSS specificity than classes, right? So what that means is this CSS style will win over this style right here. If I go into my app.css file, we can see that the app header class right here defines a totally separate background color. It's that dark blue or dark black. And that is losing out to this thing because it has higher specificity. Inline styles have one of the highest specificities in CSS, which means they will always win out whenever there is a conflict and whenever the browser needs to figure out which style is actually going to take precedence and win over. So inline styles always win out. That's why this background color wins out over the background color defined in this CSS class. So this is one technical way to avoid pollution, right? Because now there's no way that this style will pollute to any other header throughout our React application. But as I mentioned at the very beginning of the lesson, inline styles are generally not considered a good practice, not just in React, but in general HTML. So while I do want to show you this syntax just so you can see the differences in JSX compared to HTML, this is not really a good long-term solution. So we can close off this lesson by removing all the code we wrote. Again, it was just for the sake of example. The key thing for you to remember is if you are ever using inline styles in React, instead of providing a string like in HTML, you have to provide a JavaScript object, which itself will be declared within the curly braces we use in JSX. And then within that JavaScript object, you declare your CSS properties, making sure to remove the hyphens and use upper camel case instead. And then the values for those CSS properties will be the actual style or value that you want to apply to that CSS property. All right, so this is kind of a short-term bad solution, but in the next lesson, we're going to start talking about CSS modules, which is a more modern, you could say more correct way to do styles in React, and one of several ways, by the way, which we're all going to explore over the course of this section. Okay, so lots of fun stuff up ahead, and I will see you in the next lesson.